Hello, Unravelers. Welcome back to Tiff Unraveled. If you are new here, then welcome. I'm Tiff. And if you started unraveling with us here today, you are stuck here. It's official. Your family, you are an unraveler. So go ahead, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel so that you can hang out with us here and yap about all of this crazy stuff. Speaking of crazy stuff, I'm so glad you're here. We have so much to get into. Grab your drink, your snacks, your all your little cozy comforts and settle in. Maybe get 2 snacks, actually. Anyway, because week 3 of KOURI Richins, full on roller coaster for me personally. I don't know what you guys thought. Roller coaster. And I was here for every loop, every drop, every twist. It was a lot. So, as always, before we dive in, I just want to take a moment to thank you guys for being here, for watching this trial with me, for commenting, for engaging, for just being a part of this community. I really love you guys so much. You make this entire thing worthwhile. The weekly updates are really long and a lot to take on like in one sitting, but honestly, I love doing it. I don't know, it makes me happy. And I'm glad that you guys are here with me just to listen to me yap about it. Anyway, also, usual disclaimer because I want to be upfront about who I am and who I'm not. And what I'm not is a lawyer, criminal justice expert, psychologist, forensic specialist. I'm no legal professional whatsoever. I am just a girl with her MacBook and her microphone, with a very deep sense of justice and an absolute inability to look away when our legal system is unfolding like this in front of us in real time. So I'm just coming at this as a layperson, a thoroughly obsessed layperson, perhaps some close to me may say, but I always encourage you to do your own research, form your own opinions, and think critically about absolutely everything you hear, no matter what source we're getting it from, right? If you have time to sit through these trials every day, please do. They are just so much fun to watch. They really are. And I'm constantly learning, and I love that you guys are here with me for that too. Okay? Okay. We're good? All right, we're good. All right. Week 3, days 10 through 14. That's what we're talking about. Buckle up because like I said, this week in the courtroom brought us absolutely everything. We had testimony from people who knew and loved Eric Richins. Of course, we had an expert witness. We had a 911 call played in full that had me absolutely, I would say, talking at my screen. I might have been yelling, like whisper yelling. Have you guys ever done that? Yeah. Yeah. And there was just some courtroom dynamics that were at times genuinely just like jaw dropping. I couldn't believe some of the stuff that I was seeing. Most of this we don't see. Anyway, we're covering all of it, all 5 days, starting right now with day 10. Let's unravel. So day 10 starts with Cody Wright. This is one of Eric's best friends. This is his business partner in C&E stonemasonry. This is the man who built something with Eric from the ground up and by any measure knew him just as well as anyone outside of Eric's immediate family. Cody got on the stand and he started by telling the jury who Eric really was to him. And what he described was what so many others have described. He was an incredibly hardworking man. He was incredibly happy in his job. He was very careful with his money. He was coaching his boys' sports teams. His kids were his world, his life, his everything. He was just working incredibly hard to build this amazing life for his children. And also, by the time that Eric died, he was a man who had expressed to his closest friends that he was struggling in his marriage and who had apparently recently consulted the divorce attorney. Again, I feel like every time a witness brings this up, it kind of just becomes a little bit more significant the longer that you sit with it. Because if Eric was planning to leave and KOURI found out about that, I feel like everything that KOURI stood to gain changes, obviously. Because if Eric leaves, she doesn't get anything. And I feel like that's important here. Does it prove anything? No. Still no. There was a big back and forth about Eric's alleged drug use, right? Prosecution asks Cody, did Eric do drugs? Cody says no. Full stop. He had never seen Eric even use really over the counter substances. He had never seen Eric use prescription substances. He had never seen Eric use illicit substances. Just a flat, unequivocal no. He described Eric as a cowboy. He's tough. He pushes through sickness, illness, injury. He doesn't sit at home because he doesn't feel good or he has a cold. When Eric had Lyme disease, he kept working. He tweaked his back so bad that he could barely walk. He was still in his truck. He was still on the job, right? And this is significant when one of the defense's theories, I never really got a clear understanding of what the defense's defense was, but many times they alluded to the fact that Eric was using substances. And so, but again, there was a lot of back and forth about this, and we'll get into that on cross. Cody mentioned, things like the work truck, who had access to it. He said that actually he found out that KOURI had taken the truck to get it worked on some maintenance. I can't remember if it was tires or whatever. When he found out where the truck was, he actually went and got it because it was property of C&E Stonemasonry. Talked about who had access to the computers, right? That their offices were at their homes. And so Eric's C&E work computer or laptop was at the home that he shared with KOURI, right? Implying that KOURI would have easy access to their work stuff, their financial stuff, all of that, right? He talked about Valentine's Day 2022. This is less than 3 weeks before Eric died. Cody says that Eric called him around 2:00 in the afternoon. And the prosecutor asks Cody, what do you remember about that call? And Cody said, the fear in his voice, the urgency of the situation, the seriousness of what was going on. He said that the only other times he had ever heard that quality of fear in Eric's voice was when Eric's mother passed away. And another time when Eric had been in a car accident and had feared that the other driver may have been gravely injured. Those are moments that you hear real terror in someone's voice, right? Real fear. And according to Cody, Valentine's Day 2022 was one of those moments. The jury was not allowed to hear what Eric said on that call, right? Hearsay rules, but they were allowed to hear from Cody that Eric was very afraid on that specific day. And I think that's something because obviously think about what we know, think about what's alleged on Valentine's Day 2022. Prosecution's theory is that KOURI attempted to poison Eric on that day, which was 3 weeks before the night that Eric actually died. And on that same day, his best friend is on the stand testifying to the fact that he heard fear in his voice, the type of fear that he'd only heard twice before in decades of friendship. So the jury will connect those dots, however they see fit. They talked about the buy-sell insurance policies, right? This is the agreement between the two partners set up so that if one died, the survivor would receive a payout to buy out the family's share of the business and the business could keep running. And again, he mentioned how someone 2 months before Eric died had accessed those policies, changed the beneficiaries, in my opinion, accidentally Cody's first, realizing the mistake and 6 minutes later changing it again and then changing it to Eric's making the changes to Eric's policy. I don't know if that's what happened. That's just what it seemed like happened. Go ahead. It's okay, babe. All right. You okay? That's what happens. Good. I'm glad. Because you're right. I mean, you can't just bail out, All right, baby, I love you. Sorry, I lost my place. Had a chat with my boy before he left for work. Anyway, basically what I was saying is we don't know exactly what happened. Those changes happened quickly and in sort of a rapid succession. And I feel like maybe that's what happened. I don't think she intended to change Cody's and make herself the beneficiary of Cody's insurance policy, but she did. And then realized it and then went back on that and then made the other changes all within 6 or something minutes. I can't remember at this point, but So he touched on that. He said, it wasn't me, it wasn't Eric. And the C&E stonemasonry business, shared this email account that Corey had access to from the office in her and Eric's home. So we can infer. I do want to touch on cross-examination because Kathy Nestor, who we all know and love so much, had some questions for Cody. And I have to be honest with you, some of it was legitimate because, of course, as always with this defense, some of their line of questioning is really good and really legitimate and makes some good points. But then they just get into stuff. I'm just like, it's kind of a stretch, right? They're just such a mixed bag. And it's anyway, the legitimate stuff, okay? Kathy Nestor pointed out and got confirmation from Cody Wright that Eric had back pain and knee issues, Lyme disease, right? Real painful conditions. And again, she's trying to lay this groundwork for the possibility that Eric would have reasons to like self-medicate. Fair enough. She also established that Cody is LDS, right? He does not drink. He does not use substances of any kind. And that perhaps Eric, out of respect for Cody's faith, never drank around him or never told him about his THC use. And so Nestor at this point was suggesting that maybe Eric used these substances in private and that he never shared these things with Cody because he was being considerate of his friend's faith and of his friend's beliefs. That's a reasonable point to raise, right? We can all agree. But then things start to get a little brow raising for me, eye rolling at times. Nestor starts trying to get Cody to talk about all of the financial details of the business, how much he made, how much Eric made, what their incomes looked like. Judge did sustain several objections on like relevance and foundation. At this point, there was a lot of sidebars, lots of freaking Corey faces from the defendant table. This is her husband's, one of his best friends and former business partner, someone who clearly loved Eric, and she is just, those faces. Anyway, I just cannot with her. Anyway, defense does go into the details of the beneficiary change. They go over the fact that it was Cody's policy that was changed, not Eric's, which means it could have been about Cody's potential death, not Eric's. And Cody said, yeah, I'm not going to lie. It was confusing. There was a change and then a switch back and then another. We didn't know exactly what had happened or why. We just knew that someone had gone in and fiddled around with these policies without authorization from myself or Eric, right? He couldn't recall every specific detail in that moment, understandably, given he's on the stand at an unaliving trial. But the bottom line remained that those changes were not made by him and those changes were not made by Eric, at least not in front of him. Cody, I think, is like a foundational witness. I don't know, but it seems like he's just kind of laying these bricks. He's not a smoking gun witness. He's giving you this foundation of who Eric was, what his habits were, how healthy he was, how afraid he sounded 3 weeks before he actually died, and how suspicious the beneficiary changes were. So, like, he's building this backdrop against the wall that all of this other evidence is going to be evaluated on. And honestly, I feel like Cody was genuine, unshakable. He clearly loved Eric. He constantly referred to Eric in present tense. He is, he is, he is. I don't think he ever said he was, which just goes to show that in Cody's mind, Eric is still this man's like best friend. I definitely don't think that the defense made a dent in that. They tried to like impeach his testimony because at one point he said that he had heard from some people that Eric had popped pills in high school and did these things called Red Devils. And Kathy Nestor, of course, thought she was like, aha, you lied. You said he never did drugs or whatever. And so there was this big outside jury presence moment where she was like, no, I want to impeach him. He lied, blah, blah, blah. He said Eric never did illicit substances. And the judge is like, well, he never said that what are these red devils? He was like, pretty sure it was Sudafed. Sudafed, Kathy Nestor. Okay. Anyway, she was hung up on this for a while. If you guys saw, you know what I'm talking about. But ultimately, I don't really think it landed. So, okay, let's move on because we have so much to get through. And I'm such a freaking yapper. All right, moving on. So after Cody came an expert witness, Matthew Throckmorton. He is a forensic document examiner. So his job was to tell the jury about forgeries, specifically the life insurance beneficiary designation forms and all of those related documents that had been signed, according to the prosecution, in Eric Richins' name by someone who was not Eric Richins. Throckmorton is there to just walk the jury through like how you compare handwriting, the way you look at letter formation, pen pressure, the shape of loops and angles, the way someone habitually forms a particular letter. And he gave his expert opinion, which was ultimately that the signature on those documents were not consistent with Eric Richins' genuine signature. But they also couldn't prove that they were KOURI Richins' handwriting. Like it was never like, this is definitely, I think it was, this is probably not Eric, probably KOURI. Okay, what does it mean? KOURI, according to the prosecution's theory, we know, changed the beneficiary designation on Eric's life insurance policies without his knowledge, or took out this life insurance policy on him without his knowledge, I should say. They are saying that KOURI is the one who forged his signature on documents that are obviously designated to funnel money to her in the event of his death, and then he died. It's not a coincidence in the prosecution's opinion, and it's not one that they're going to let the jury forget. It is one of the charges that she is facing in this trial. So defense's cross-examination of Throckmorton was, shall we say, persistent, as it should be for a defense. Listen, I may not like these people. I may get like those like ew kind of vibes. Sometimes they're doing their job for sure. I mean, they're fighting to the death for KOURI, even when they know the rest of us are going to be rolling our eyes but they do it anyway. And that's their job. I don't think anyone will be able to say that she didn't get a fair trial. I mean, unless you disagree, please let me know. But they're fighting even when I'm like, why? Anyway, again, I'm not a lawyer, but I can see they're doing it. They're doing it. They're doing something. Are they doing what they want to be doing? Are they doing what they intend to do? Are they doing what they hope to do? I don't know. You guys let me know. But they're doing it. Anyway, see, here I go. Okay. So they try to like chip away at all of these probabilities. If it's only probably not Eric's signature, doesn't that leave room for it being Eric's signature? Is it possible that someone under the influence of substances, their handwriting would look a little different, blah, blah, blah. Again, fair point. I get what they're doing. But Throckmorton held firm. He explained the scale, he explained his methodology, and he didn't really budge. He also confirmed that a simulated forgery, by definition, means that forgers suppress their own natural writing habits in order to imitate someone else's writing habits, right? Which is why you cannot definitively identify the forger from that signature, but you can exclude the person that it's supposed to represent, if that makes sense. So defense, of course, also went after his methodology, the fact that he was working from documents that were provided by Eric's family rather than subpoenaed directly from, source institutions. This was a PDF. This was a copy, right? Those kinds of things. A fair challenge to raise, right? But the sheer number of known comparison signatures, which I think was like 80 something, is kind of hard to dismiss. And again, Throckmorton's conclusion didn't waver. Eric Richins probably did not sign that document. KOURI Richins is being charged with forgery, right? We have this 30-year veteran forensic document examiner, right, with FBI level training, who's telling the jury that the signature on these life insurance documents probably is not Eric. She's listed as the beneficiary. They cannot definitively say who the forger is. I don't know if you were sitting on the jury, would you make an inference as to like, okay, well, who else would it have been, right? KOURI was the one who stands to get all this money. That's where my head is. Is this hard proof that KOURI signed those documents? I don't think it's proof. Do I have am I drawing my own conclusions from that? Sure. Am I alone in that? I don't know. You tell me. But if Kouri was the one who changed Eric's insurance beneficiary designation or took out this life insurance policy completely without him knowing about it, which is what I think this one was, by forging his signature, of course, that gives her direct financial motive, which I think is the point, obviously, that prosecution is trying to make, right? She needed Eric to not be alive, and she needed to make sure that she was the one who received that money when he died. So I don't think that Throckmorton is there just to testify to the forgery charge. I think it also connects to the unaliving charge in a pretty devastating way if the jury is convinced by his testimony. What did you guys think? All right. Moving on, we arrive at the part of the morning. This one ruffled my feathers, okay? Before calling the next witness after Mr. Throckmorton, prosecution moved to admit and publish Kouri's 911 call in full, which was placed on the morning of March 4th, 2022, when she says she discovered her husband, Eric, unresponsive. I want to talk about this call. I have to talk about this call. I want to be careful because there's a lot here. The call starts with Kouri telling the dispatcher that her husband isn't breathing and that he's cold. When the dispatcher asks her to confirm, is he not breathing? She says no. Dispatcher says, can you start CPR? Her first response is simply, no. I don't know how. Not, I don't know, I can try. I'm really scared, but I'll try. Not that, just no. Dispatcher does what good dispatchers do. And she says, I'm here for you. I'm going to walk you through it. I'm going to get you through this. Just listen to me. And she agrees. They ask if she can get him onto the floor. She says, I can't. I can't touch him. I can't touch him. She says, I'm shaking. I can't. And she says at one point on the 911 call, I can't move him. He's dead weight. This is your husband. It makes me, I get it. This is your husband. This is the father of your children. And you just say, no, I can't. It's just dead weight. I can't. The dispatcher, she's very patient. She's very encouraging. She's very professional. She continues to try to guide Kouri through this. They get her to eventually attempt to get him on the floor. CPR begins, and someone actually, because someone comes in, if you guys know, so this person enters the home and takes over, but they are saying that paramedics are on their way. I'm not sure. I'm not sure who this was. Was it an EMT? I'm not sure. Was it a first responder of some sort? But paramedics were on their way. I don't know. If you guys know, let me know. Anyway, throughout this entire call, okay, if you guys heard it, should I play it? I don't know. Throughout this entire call, what strikes me is, in my opinion, complete absence of urgency, hesitation, resistance, even, in my opinion. I just felt like the tone was wrong. I feel like if my loved one's life was on the line, right? That if my spouse or my children or just any of my loved ones genuinely needed immediate medical intervention, I feel like the tone and behavior would be different. Now, maybe I'm responding to that as someone who works in healthcare. Maybe my brain is just wired a little bit differently, and I have a little bit of bias there because in my brain, I'm just like, what are you actually doing right now? Why is there 14 seconds of you just not even saying anything? Like, why are there these constant pauses and just all I can hear you doing is breathing on this call? You're not responding, you're not trying, you're not crying, you're not. I couldn't understand. I could not wrap my brain around what was happening on this 911 call. There was just no sense of urgency, in my opinion. That's it. Maybe you guys heard something different. Maybe I missed something. That's just my opinion. You can hear like her children come in the room and she's like, go, no, don't come in here, sending her children out of the room, which definitely could just be her being protective. Absolutely. I want to be fair. I want to be measured. I am completely aware and totally understand that people respond to crisis differently. Trauma affects people in absolutely unpredictable ways. Shock is real. And sometimes when someone is in shock, people just completely freeze. I don't want to sit here and say that everyone who freezes in a crisis situation is an unaliver. That is not at all what I'm saying. But here's the thing. This call, I feel like, needs to be heard in context, right? Not in isolation. When you set it next to the fact that KOURI was reportedly, according to testimony, partying the next day, right? Like celebrating something, the call just to me takes on a very different character when you set it next to everything else that we've heard about her behavior, about, her financial desperation, about the recent texts and erasure of texts with Carmen Lauber, the forged insurance documents, the changed beneficiaries. All of this together is what is painting the picture for me that makes this 911 call slightly more haunting, maybe. And it's not a pretty picture that it's painting. Anyway, the jury heard that call. They sat in the courtroom. They listened to the wife of a dying man say, "No, I can't perform CPR. I just don't know how." Or, "No, I can't touch him." Or, "No, he's just dead weight." They heard that. I feel like they'll remember it. So next up on the stand, we had Detective Jamie Woody. So she's actually a canine officer now, but she was, at the time of this investigation, she was a detective with the Summit County Sheriff's Office. And she caught this call in a completely random on-call rotation. She had no prior experience with poisoning cases, digital forensics, forensic accounting. None of what this case turned into she had experience with when she was called to this scene of what I think when a lot of first responders got there, it just was like a death in the home, right? I don't think anyone knew what this was going to turn into, obviously. Her biggest prior case as a lead investigator were SA. It was like an SA case. And that's what she did primarily, actually. But by the luck of her rotation, she was handed probably one of the most complex unaliving cases in her entire career. And I think that matters a little bit for context because what the prosecution is showing you here is not Detective Woody being perfect. She wasn't. She acknowledged limitations in her investigation. And what prosecution is trying to show is that despite the challenges, because I'm pretty sure that they knew the defense was going to raise a lot of these questions, despite these challenges, despite the complexity, despite what this case turned into, the case was built, evidence was gathered, and according to prosecution, the truth came out. So she first starts with the driveway conversation with Amy. So when Detective Woody arrived at the Richins home in that early morning on March 4th, she encountered Eric's sister, Amy, at the bottom of the driveway before she even walked in the front door. And Amy essentially laid out that she and Eric were not in the best place, that KOURI had been acting erratic when she had been drinking, and that, here it comes, Eric told Amy that he thought KOURI was going to unalive him before Detective Woody even saw Eric's body, before she even got into the home, before she did a single iota of investigating. Eric's own sister told her he said she was going to unalive him. Detective Woody said, "Of course, that's going to make me approach this scene with a more critical eye." When Woody interviewed KOURI at the scene that morning, KOURI goes on to describe Eric as a very healthy guy. He ran marathons. She said that at some point a long time ago, he had pain medication prescribed to him, but he didn't like taking anything and took vitamins and supplements instead. She said he's been complaining of chest pain. That's when KOURI starts like shooting out all of these things. Oh, he had his allergy shots. Oh, he had been complaining of chest pain. Oh, he didn't. Like, in my opinion, kind of giving them all the reasons to like, don't look here, look there, that kind of vibe. Anyway, that's just my opinion. But what she did was paint a picture of a very healthy man who did not use substances. She said that. He didn't use substances. He didn't self-medicate. And then when Woody asked if he used street substances, Kouri's response was also no, flat out no. Keep that in mind because, again, later after her arrest, that defense shifts to, oh, he had a substance problem. He was taking pain pills. Maybe he accidentally overdosed. But on the morning that he died, right before she had any real reason to craft a narrative, she told the detective he was healthy. He didn't use substances, prescription or street or otherwise. He didn't like taking anything. Then we talk about the trash cans. When Woody looked around the death scene, she noticed that the bedroom trash cans were empty. She asked Kouri about it, and Kouri said that her housekeeper had emptied them. Woody asked for the housekeeper's name. Kouri couldn't remember. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, what? This is your housekeeper. This is the woman who comes to your home on a regular basis. This is the woman who emptied the trash cans the night that your husband died. And you don't know her name? Is that weird to anyone else? Perhaps not, but to me, it is. It is. For context, the housekeeper apparently came around 8:30 p.m. the night that Eric died, right? Meaning that the trash was taken out hours before Eric's body was found. So perhaps we can think about what was in those trash cans. I don't know. I don't know. Anyway, she starts talking about the April 13th search warrant. On April 8th, so this was about 5 weeks after Eric's death. That's when preliminary toxicology reports had come out that Eric Richins had died of a massive fent overdose, which again changes everything. It changes everything. So Woody obtained the search warrant, and on April 13th, officers searched the Richins' homes, their vehicles. They seized like digital devices, including the phones, Kouri's phone, Eric's phone. Did they find fent? No. Did they find substance paraphernalia? No. They did find the THC products, which they sent to the state crime lab for testing, and those results came back confirming that there was no fent in those THC gummies. Because again, while I have no solid stance on the defense's theory, because, well, if you know how this week ends, you know we don't get anything from the defense, but we'll get into that later. But what they're alluding to, one of the things that they have alluded to is that Eric accidentally ingested the fent through laced THC gummies, right? And the lab results say, nope, didn't happen here. Those gummies were clean. Well, clean, they're THC gummies. They had THC. They did not have fent in them. So defense cross-examination of Detective Woody, actually pretty effective in places because, of course, Nestor gets up there and highlights that Woody didn't try to receive or try to get an electronic warrant to search more of the house on the night of Eric's death. She said she went in with a more critical eye. Right. I can understand if you go into the home. Guys, don't come for me. I'm just playing devil's advocate here. Okay. I can understand if you're going into the home thinking this was just a death scene, someone had died in their sleep, or maybe an accidental overdose, right? Like not knowing what you were walking into, you might not get a search warrant that night unless something blatantly screams like suspicious, suspicious, suspicious. But something did kind of scream suspicious, according to Detective Woody's own testimony, that Amy had met her in the driveway and had said some things that Detective Woody said herself made her go into the home with a more critical eye. Should she have tried to obtain a search warrant of the home that night based on her having another version of what possibly could have gone on in the home that night? I can see why this point is being made 100%. She talked about the empty hydrocodone bottle that was found near the bed, the one that was collected and photographed, but was never swabbed, never tested. She pointed out that Detective Woody never listened to the 911 call during her investigation, at least not in any way that she could remember or recall while she was on the stand. She noted that her team did not search the large trash cans in the garage. They did not search Eric's vehicles that night. They did not ask Kouri the kind of like detailed follow-up questions that a more experienced homicide detective might have asked. Nestor also made this point worth noting. Given that Kouri was told in April of 2022 that Eric had died of a fent overdose, maybe her subsequent Google searches about fent weren't sinister. Maybe she was just trying to understand what had happened to her husband. Reasonable argument to make, right? But here's what didn't change under cross. The moment that Amy told Woody in that driveway that Eric thought that Kouri was trying to unalive him, right? Kouri's own statements that he was healthy and he was drug-free, the emptied trash cans, the housekeeper's, what was her name? That was weird. The fact that the gummies that they were alluding to maybe were lace, those came back with no traces of fent. Those facts were not touched. Again, was Detective Woody a perfect detective? No. Inexperienced? Perhaps. Was she a perfect witness? No. Does the jury kind of have to weigh, all of these things in Woody's testimony? Absolutely. We all do. Did defense make some good points? Yes. Are there still facts that remain, even when Detective Woody comes off the stand, that I'm like, yeah, okay, but still? Also, yes. I mean, because she did acknowledge gaps in the investigation. And to me, I actually think that that kind of honesty from a witness, even an investigator, can somewhat in the mind, right? If I'm thinking like a lay person sitting on the jury, can somewhat build credibility. It doesn't completely destroy it, in my opinion. I do think that she gave the jury a pretty critical foundation, what the scene looked like, what Kouri said that morning, what Amy told her in the driveway, how the toxicology reports changed the entire trajectory of this investigation. I think that she is the bridge between the scene of the crime and the investigation that followed. By the way, just because I've said Amy's name a few times here, Amy, Katie, and Jean Richins have been in that courtroom every single day since this trial started. And I just want all of us to think about them and imagine how difficult this is for them. And the way they are showing up for Eric is just, it's everything. I love it. Okay, Unravelers, save the best witness of the day for the last witness of the day, right? Yes. I would argue best witness prosecution had the entirety of their presentation of their case in chief. Okay. Our final witness of day 10 was a man named Todd Gabler, private investigator, and I need you to understand. This man walked into this courtroom like with a neck brace in his back pocket, had just had like this major spinal fusion surgery, got on the stand, said he refused to take his pain medication because he wanted to be mentally sharp. He wanted to be present for his testimony. He had only taken Tylenol that morning and then proceeded to be one of the most methodical, precise, unflappable witnesses I have watched on the stand in a long time. I I loved watching this part. I've rewatched this part of the trial like twice, I think, at this point. Todd Gabler has been a private investigator for 34 years. He's worked approximately 100 homicide cases. And here's the kicker. Every single time that this man has come to court to testify, he's worked on that other table. He has been a witness for the defense. He has never once testified for a prosecution until this case, until the evidence was so clear to him that he sat down at the prosecution's table instead. And he was hired by Eric Richins' estate, specifically by Katie Richins Benson, Eric's sister, who obviously we've established, she served as the trustee of Eric's estate. He was hired initially as an investigator in response to this civil lawsuit that Kouri had filed trying to claim assets from Eric's estate or whatever. But very quickly for him, that investigation expanded to encompass the question of how Eric died. And Gabler did what it sounds like Gabler does, babes. He built a case. He built a case. Todd Gabler is a hypothesis tester. He explained this beautifully on the stand. From the very beginning, he identified two competing hypotheses, right? One, did Eric take his own life or accidentally overdose? That's a possibility. Two, Kouri Richins surreptitiously had Eric ingest a massive amount of fent and unalived him. Every single piece of evidence that he gathered, every interview that Todd Gabler conducted, every single record that he analyzed, all of it went into testing both of those hypotheses, according to him, simultaneously. He was not trying to prove one, he was not trying to prove the other. He was letting the evidence tell him what happened. And the evidence told him something here. And he said that even when he started his investigation, he had a sit down with the Richins family and said, listen, I'm not here to find anything one way or the other way. I'm here to find the truth. And I got to tell you, you might not like what the truth is. If Eric took his own life and that's the truth, you have to sit with that. If Eric accidentally took this substance thinking it was another substance, but essentially it was accidentally, but he did this willingly and on his own accord, you have to sit with that. If KOURI is responsible for the unaliving of your brother's son friend, you have to also sit with that. I'm not here to, I have no tunnel vision. I'm not going one way or the other. I go where the evidence leads me. If the truth is the truth, and you have to accept it, whichever truth that is. Todd Gabler gets up there, says he conducted between 40 and 50 interviews over the course of his investigation. He identified himself as who he was and what his purpose was every single time. He recorded every interview whenever possible. He produced written summaries, which he also turned over to law enforcement with his client's permission every single time. He interviewed Eric's friends, his business associates, his family, friends of KOURI, friends of Eric, everyone encompassing their business worlds. Everyone he could, he did. He even tried to interview KOURI's family members who would not cooperate. And then he also, and this is something, attempted to sit down with KOURI herself. She called him, actually, on January 19th, 2023. She called him seemingly very angry about his investigation. And he told her, I will not speak to you outside of the presence of your attorney. That would be unethical of me to do. He notified her lawyer that she had called him. He requested a formal interview if she wanted to talk with him. He wanted it to be in the presence of her attorney. Multiple times after that, he requested that meeting and he was never granted once. They go over cell phone, billing records. Todd Gabler himself had actually obtained cell phone billing records for both KOURI and Eric and C&E Masonry's Verizon accounts, right? With Cody Wright's authorization, of course, he did everything with permission and authorization, covering January of 2022 through February of 2023. He analyzed the weight of each contact, how many times each number appeared on these records, whether these contacts were text only or voice and text, right? Time of day patterns. The highest weight contact on KOURI's phone, her mother. Second, Eric. And right there, very close in weight during that time frame with hundreds of text messages in that initial data set alone, Carmen Lauber. Now, again, if you've been following this trial, which I'm sure if you're here, you have been, Carmen Lauber is someone that you know. She is literally a key witness, a key figure. Carmen does have an extensive criminal history involving substance use and potentially sales of substances. It was Gabler who said when he received that information, when he ran her contact weight, he saw something that concerned him. Hundreds of text messages between KOURI and Carmen. And so Gabler says he was the one who alerted the sheriff's office to these contacts, to these messages and calls, etc. And Carmen Lauber eventually became what she became, which is one of the central witnesses in this case. Then we get into the searches of the Richins' home, right? So after KOURI's arrest, Gabler was authorized by the estate to search the home. He went in, he's wearing this GoPro chest-mounted camera. It's all backed up by an audio recorder. He spent days documenting absolutely everything. He was scanning thousands of documents for the garage office. He found items that he thought may have some evidentiary value, and instead, rather than touching them, messing with them, he called authorities to come and get those items with a warrant. He found this audio recorder in the dresser drawer. He found the letter, which we now know as the baby cakes letter. Defense called it the My Princess letter. He found that letter on May 10th in the bottom drawer of the vanity on Eric's side of the bed. This man was very meticulous in his documentation. Then we get into like some of the computer forensics. Gabler had also examined the C&E stonemasonry computer, which had passed through several hands. At this point, it went from Becky, who was a C&E stonemasonry employee. She's the one who retrieved it after Eric died. And then it went to Katie, and then it went to Mr. Gabler. On this computer, he found evidence of some digital activity. He had cloned Eric's iPhone from an iCloud backup using a technique where he essentially just kind of repopulates a blank iPhone with Eric's data. He examined from there all of the call logs, all of the text histories, all of the web activity. And yeah, Todd Gabler, he put GPS tracking devices on Corey's car, on our mother's car, and on another vehicle that was associated with Carmen Lauber's residence. He did this legally following the Utah Private Investigator Regulation Act. And everything that he found, he turned over to law enforcement. Is it a little intense? Yes. Is it legal? Also, yes. Is it relevant? Absolutely. Because understanding the movements of all of these people potentially involved in an unaliving at this point is exactly what a thorough investigator does. You guys might have different opinions on private investigators, and, trust me, Kathy Nestor gets into that. She definitely gets into that. In fact, let's go into her cross-examination now, shall we? Ooh, buckle up, babes. Buckle up. Now, the defense cross-examination of Todd Gabler. You already know, Kathy Nestor, she's gonna come in swinging, okay? Did any of her punches land? Honestly, with this man on the stand, I don't believe they did. But she did point out correctly that Todd Gabler is not law enforcement, has never been law enforcement. He doesn't need a warrant to do any of the things that he does. She noted that he had a key to the Richins home. He went in alone on multiple occasions. She raised the issue of a safe that he removed from inside the house, took to a locksmith, and had opened. Gloves potentially contaminating evidence. She also tried to corner him on the safe opening method itself. Gabler clarified it wasn't busted open. He said the locksmith had a technique called bumping, which was just, I don't know, something about the door and the frame, whatever, and that apparently it got dropped on the ground. And that's what finally opened it. A rubber mallet may have been involved. Look, I don't know. It's probably fine, right? It's totally fine. Oh my God. One of my favorite parts of the entire cross-examination, probably one of my favorite parts of the entirety of day 10. Kathy Nestor had been building towards what I feel like she thought was this big gotcha, right? She starts asking Gabler about taking electronics out of the house, putting things in his Tesla. I don't know what Kathy Nestor's obsession with Todd Gabler driving a Tesla was. I don't know, but she literally asked him what kind of car he drove. When he said Tesla, she continued to say Tesla throughout she was like, oh, you put it in your Tesla? Did you put it in your Tesla? Did you drive away in your Tesla? Kathy, what's going on? Babe, just go to the dealership. It's fine. I'm sure they can figure something out. You can have one if you want one. Anyway, all right. Putting these electronics in his Tesla and driving away, right? Gabler says, I do remember taking some electronics. Yeah, but it wasn't the C&E computer. And she presses, really? So what computer was it? And he was like, I don't really recall offhand. And she says, with what I can only describe as this significant, dramatic energy. She says, well, we're going to pull up the video in just a minute. I'll refresh your memory. Oh, a video? She has a video? You can tell Kathy Nestor has been waiting for this moment, okay? She tells her team to pull up exhibit A, B, C, D, E, F, G. There is a pause while they find it, right? The whole courtroom is waiting, right? This is clearly supposed to be a moment. She gets it up on screen. She shows it to Gabler and she presents it like, here, explain this, sir. What do you say now? Gabler looks at the video that's on screen and he says, that laptop? And she's like, yeah, that one. And he's like, yeah, that's my laptop. I'm scanning into my laptop the documents that I'm going through in the office. That is my laptop. Nestor's like, that black one? And he's like, yes, that black one, that belongs to me, ma'am. Okay, so you're scanning all the documents you're finding in the office and loading them into your laptop. That's what you're doing here. And he's like, yes. Kathy, that was the gotcha? The gotcha of the cross was you proving that Gabler had his own laptop with him while doing his job? Like, the man documented very meticulously that he was doing exactly what he said he was doing with his own equipment, which he brought to do his job. The video was made by Gabler himself for exactly this purpose. As he had noted earlier in his testimony, he literally had said when Nestor first showed or first threatened to show him this video, he's like, that's why I make videos. Like, he knew. He always knew. This man, I just loved him. Anyway, it just seemed like he was always like 5 steps ahead of Kathy Nestor, and she just walked right into that one. Anyway, she then goes on to try to establish that he was working in parallel with law enforcement, but somehow outside all of the rules that law enforcement has to follow. You know, doing warrantless searches, turning results over to the police, effectively just being like an unaccountable actor in this entire investigation. And here's the thing, and I know a lot of people may agree with this point that she was trying to make, because some of those points do have merit. It is a legitimate question whether evidence gathered by private investigators without warrants and potentially mishandled are admissible and reliable pieces of evidence. I definitely feel like those are fair arguments for the defense to make. But again, true to Todd Gabler, he didn't blink. He answered every single question of hers with precision, with composure. He laughed at her a couple times. But when she started to suggest that he couldn't be trusted because he didn't need a warrant, he was like, I am not a state actor. I've never been a state actor. I will never be a state actor. I have permission by the property owner. I think he even made a statement. He was like, I don't need to be babysat by law enforcement. And again, some of you may have different feelings about those kinds of things. When she implied that he was just, oh, so you just happen to be finding all of these things that police missed. He goes on to say that's true in a lot of the cases that I handle. Like, police never get everything, ever. When she pushed him on the number of times that he met with law enforcement, clearly implying that maybe things were getting a little too cozy, he told her, like, I don't know, the number is not relevant to me. And he offered, like, I don't know, half a dozen as an approximate before, finishing that line of questioning. Then Nestor brings up him calling police every time he found something, that he was somehow directing their investigation. Well, didn't they ever ask you to stop? She says, shouldn't they have asked you to stop? And he's like, I would note that no, they didn't tell me to stop. But if they had told me to stop, I would have ignored them. Bro, undefeated. Anyway, then the defense brings up these messages that were touched on by Todd Gabler, these Bryce Knudsen and Eric messages. Apparently, I didn't like this part. They don't know what they were doing. I don't know if they were attempting to suggest that Eric's marriage was in trouble because he was doing things that might paint him a little bit differently. Todd Gabler literally laughed out loud on the stand. He was like, these were very clearly sarcasm and jokes. I'm not going to get into them because I just don't like victim shaming, which I feel like is what Kathy Nestor was trying to do, especially when they're completely fucking irrelevant to the entire case. In fact, I feel like if the things that she was trying to imply were true, it would have given Kouri Richins even more motive to do what she has allegedly done. But again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because it really kind of made me mad. If you guys watched it, you know what I'm talking about. If not, just go back and watch the cross of Todd Gabler and you'll get into the Knudsen messages. Anyway, that entire line of questioning, it didn't land. But by the time cross-examination wrapped up, I was giving this man a standing ovation. I really feel like he gave Kathy Nestor a run for her money. I definitely feel like she met her match in Todd Gabler. And I noticed some things happening because Kouri's faces, which I've used to gauge like what's happening in this trial, what's happening in this courtroom, right? Her faces go from, all of these snarky, disgusting faces to witnesses that had taken a stand earlier in the day to sitting there with her arms crossed, looking very increasingly worried, in my opinion. As well she might. Anyway, Todd Gabler was, in my opinion, I'm sorry I'm going on really long with this one, but he was probably one of the most valuable witnesses, in my opinion, to the prosecution as far as who they've put on the stand. No, he's not a cop. He's not employed by the state or the government in any capacity. However, I feel like that goes to the prosecution because he's not someone that the defense can accuse of following this prosecutorial narrative, right? He's just a 34-year-old veteran who has spent his entire career actually on the other side of that courtroom, on the defense table, who was hired to find the truth, whatever that truth was. And in my opinion, followed the evidence where it led him. And it led him here at the prosecution table. I feel like this was the man who identified Carmen Lauber before law enforcement even knew to take a look at her. He found evidence in the house after police had already searched it multiple times. He documented absolutely everything, audio, video, whatever, because he knew from the beginning that his work would be scrutinized in exactly this kind of setting. And I just don't think that's the behavior of someone with something to hide, which I feel like defense kind of alludes to. I feel like that's the behavior of a professional. And the fact that this man literally had to put on a neck brace to hold his head up halfway through his testimony, he wanted to give his best. He came to testify. I feel like he meant every single word that he said. So that was just my opinion on Todd Gabler. I loved him. That's actually it. That's day 10, right? We had a foundational friend. We had a forensic expert. We had the 911 call. We had the lead detective, one of the lead detectives, the lead detective in the beginning. And then we had one extraordinary private investigator. And each one of them, I feel like in their own way, laid another brick in the wall that the prosecution is building against Kouri Richins. But we are far from done. I know we're already an hour into this video. The rest of them aren't as long, except when we get to O'Driscoll, I'll kind of deep dive his testimony because there's a lot there. But we'll kind of try to skim through the next couple of days. But trust me when I say the momentum does not slow down, in my opinion. There is more to come. And you're going to want to be here for it. So if you have to, take a breath, pause, take a stretch, eat a snack. I don't know, but come back because now we're getting into day 11. So here's the thing about day 11 that I feel like you need to know up front. The jury heard approximately 10 minutes of actual testimony. Everything else, which was about 2.5 hours of the day, happened without the jury in the room. And most of what happened on day 11 happened in those 2.5 hours. The testimony, in my opinion, was just like, okay, sure. Okay, cool. Thank you. The morning was just a outside jury presence motions marathon. Defense had issues with the O'Driscoll interview transcripts, right? There was a bunch of redactions that they want lifted. There was a bunch of portions that they needed to come in for completeness. The judge worked through this with both sides, page by page, with, I love him, characteristic precision. Like multiple times, Nestor raised a redaction issue and then had to withdraw it because the content had already come in through other testimony. There was a bunch of pages in the transcript, withdrawn, already in evidence. I don't know. I hardly knew what any of this meant, but for some reason I could not look away. It was so interesting. I felt like we shouldn't be seeing this. I also felt like, isn't this what preliminary hearings are for? I guess as more testimony comes out, this can arise. I guess that makes sense. It just felt to me like we were watching what should have been preliminary hearings happening on day 11 of trial, right? Anyway, Judge Mrazek, true to Judge Mrazek form, very patient, extraordinarily patient. So I guess I can touch on some of the things they went over. So buried again in the middle of all of these motions and this whole marathon that was happening, prosecution wanted to admit 3 text messages from the jail system. These were texts sent by Kouri to her brother, JD. And of course, defense objected and said their objection was based on relevance. I want you to understand, we can see what defense has been doing throughout this entire trial, right? There really hasn't been presented by the defense a clean alternative theory. I have no idea what defense's alternative theory is, even now as I sit here saying all of these things. They haven't said someone else did it. They haven't said it was, they've alluded to, but they haven't said it was accidental contamination. They haven't said, they haven't said anything. They're just throwing a bunch of in the mix and hoping something is going to stick in the minds of the jury. I feel like it's absolutely a strategy. Like, just throw a bunch of shit at the wall, see what sticks. Like, the jury is going to hear it. So just put it out there. You know what I mean? Because it's all come out through like cross examination. Like through the questions that they've asked, they've been painting this portrait of like Eric Richins, a man who was stressed, a man who was in pain, a man who was struggling in his marriage, a man who was unhappy, a man who, right? The implication has been right there under the surface of dozens of questions, might have had a reason to want to exit his situation. They haven't come right out and said that, but I feel like it's been there. And now the prosecution wants to admit these jail texts in which the topic is whether Eric ever talked about self-unaliving. And Kathy Nestor is saying objection on relevance. And the judge actually looks at Kathy Nestor essentially and was like, you don't see the relevance of whether Mr. Richins ever actually spoke about self-unaliving? Because here's what's in those texts. Kouri's brother, DJ, asks her, did Eric ever talk about self-unaliving? Right? And Kouri's answer from her jail cell and in her own words says, not self-unaliving specifically. He just said things like, if anything ever happened to me, you guys would be set for life. Like when he went hunting or snowmobiling or something. Like if there was ever an accident or if there was ever a reason that Eric was no longer living, Kouri and the kids would be set for life. That kind of thing, right? Set for life. These words to me hang in a courtroom, right? Like something's just been dropped from a great height. Judge clarified out loud. And just to be clear, you don't want to admit the statement that Eric told her they'd be set for life if he died. And defense attorney obviously is like, no. Right, of course. The judge's expression communicated a considerable amount without any additional words. But so this is not the prosecution claiming that Kouri had motive. This is Kouri herself in a text to her brother from a jail cell reporting that Eric used to tell her that she would be set for life if they died. So anyway, the judge did end up admitting these text messages with a limiting jury instruction, basically the same instruction we've heard a few times before. The jury can consider it not for the truth of the matter, but for the effect it had on Kouri or her state of mind, her understanding of her financial situation if Eric were no longer alive, not for whether Eric actually said it, but the jury hears it either way. Again, there was just a bunch of stuff going, a bunch of back and forth. After all of that, the jury was brought in and heard approximately 10 minutes of testimony from Chris Cochodemos. He had already been on the stand. He gets back up on the stand, and his only reason for being there is to clarify that the timestamps that he had given earlier were in Eastern time. Subtract 2 hours for Utah time. That's it. Okay. 10 minutes of like time zone math. The jury went home before lunch. During all of the, okay, I forgot to mention this because this was obviously a big thing. So while they're going through all of this, what can be admitted for O'Driscoll? What can be admitted for Carmen Lover? Well, like, what's going to go back? What's going to lie? All defense was acting like a bunch of big crybabies at this time. There was a bunch of should we play the video? I'd like to play these parts of the video with these parts redacted, right? Prosecution says that. Defense is like, no, we don't want any of it to go in. And then she's like, well, if we can't get the parts that we want to go in, then we'll just submit all of it, which was like 1,000 pages of transcripts. Defense was like, well, no, if we can't get what we want, then just send all of it. Girl, you know the jury is not fixing to read. And maybe that's her point. Maybe it's like, fine, then send it all back. If we can't get our way, then send all of it back. And their point's going to get lost in all of that that they have to read through or will refuse to read through. Who's going to read through that, really, in deliberations? Not them, right? They're not going to. And so defense may be strategizing here and say, fine, if we can't get our way, send it all back. And prosecution's point will be moot because it'll be lost amidst all of this irrelevant context, right? Anyway, big back and forth. Felt like we shouldn't have been seeing this stuff happen, but we were. And poor Judge Mrazek, oh my God, you could tell he was just so over it. But we continue. As defense requested a 2-day continuance, judge said, no, I'll give you to 6 p.m. tonight. She said, can I have till 10? He's like, then when are we supposed to do our work, right? No, you can't have till 10. You can have till 6. What time do you guys want to be back tomorrow? You know, he got through it. Anyway, so it's day 11, essentially, sort of. Prosecution and defense, well, defense had till 6 p.m. to, figure their out, put it in motion. Prosecution agreed to have everything that, they needed to have redacted, whether in video or in transcripts, et cetera, by the next day. Court was to resume at 1 p.m. the following day. And that's where we'll pick up. By the end of day 11, we knew 2 things were happening. Brace yourself, okay? What we knew was Carmen Lauber was going to be recalled to the stand. And finally, we were going to hear from the lead detective, Detective O'Driscoll, on this day, right? We've been waiting for this. The evidence that came in through O'Driscoll, good evidence. The kind of evidence makes you sit up in your seat, makes you pay attention, gets your ears to perk up a little bit, right? It forgets that you were ever a little bit tired of the courtroom dynamics, the back and forth. He talks about the orange notebook. He talks about the kitchen cabinet cheat sheet. He talks about the ghostwriter, which I know there have been just a lot of fun comments about Kouri's book, Ghostwriter Reveal. He talks about the jail call. He talks about the walk the dog letter, right? This was the 6 handwritten pages, and he read them aloud. Well, the parts that were admitted, I think it was only like 3 pages of the letter, read aloud, word by word, as KOURI Richins sits at her defense table, making all her faces. The evidence that he had to present was, some of the strongest evidence of the case, of like, this is why we're here. We give it to us, right? Let us see it. What? I told you to get your snacks. I have my dinner. It's pizza. Okay? What are you having? Let me know. Look away. I'll be back. If you don't eat the crust of your pizza, what are you doing? Grow up. What I will say, and I'll probably touch more on it later because this testimony does continue through this or past this day and into the next one. O'Driscoll, the witness, right? Not the evidence that he was being tied to, but O'Driscoll, the witness, particularly under cross-examination, which again, I said I'll get into more, I guess was a little bit more uneven than I expected. And I'm just going to say that plainly. Again, I'll get into it more when we get there, but I wanted to name it on top rather than like let the evidence carry more water than it has to, because the jury is evaluating the evidence, but I feel like juries also evaluate witnesses. And I just really think it's worth being talked about. I think it's worth being precise. Anyway, with that being said, let's get into what he brought, because I do think that that holds a lot of weight here. However, that is not how the trial day started. The trial day started with Carmen Lauber being recalled to the stand. So there had been a discovery dispute, right? Information about Carmen Lauber's drug court probation violations, specifically a violation that occurred in November of 2023. State apparently had information that defense argued they should have received earlier because it could have affected their original cross-examination. And so as a remedy, Judge Mrazek did rule that Carmen could be recalled today, so that defense could cross-examine her specifically on those violations. The state had no questions for her on direct. They just essentially re-swore her back in and handed her over. So the ball was entirely in defense's court. Defense attorney Lewis handled Carmen Lauber's cross-examination or re-cross-examination, which I already was going into with a little bit of an uneasy feeling, given what we had seen from Wendy Lewis versus Carmen Lauber in their initial cross-examination of her. But it wasn't as bad. I guess she thought all her damage had been done. But the goal was very clear. She wanted to establish that Carmen had violated her probation. She had lied to the judge about it, and her credibility as a key witness for the prosecution should be seriously questioned. Here's what they got. Carmen confirmed that, yes, she had been on probation since May of 2023. She confirmed that Detective Maynard, the same detective who had interviewed her extensively in this case, was also her probation officer. She confirmed that she texted him regularly, essentially daily, as required, though she acknowledged that sometimes those check-ins were made via phone call and that she would forget to do so a few days here and there. Defense immediately brings up a gun. They talk about the fact that when law enforcement executed a search warrant on Carmen's residence in April of 2023, they found a firearm under her bed. Carmen's a convicted felon. We know this. And a convicted felon in possession of a firearm is a serious legal issue. Redirect did touch on this, though, by saying that the firearm was found before the probation agreement ever even existed on paper. The gun was found on April something, 20 something, and she didn't formally sign her probation agreement until May 18th. So anyway, as a technical matter, Lewis herself had to concede it wasn't really a probation violation because probation hadn't formally started yet. Does it look great for Carmen? No. Does it strip the defense of a clean impeachment that they were hoping for? I think so. Yeah. Then they talk about the concert. Carmen went to a concert in October of 2023, and there was a Summit County detective there who observed her with alcohol in her hand. So, of course, defense is like, you violated. Okay. They also touched that she had violated curfew. So Carmen's explanation was, yeah, my friends had bought the tickets. And so I had agreed that in return for them purchasing the tickets, I would purchase like their alcohol concessions, etc. And so when the detective saw her there, yes, she had drinks, alcoholic ones included, and snacks and whatever in her hand, but that she had never consumed the alcohol herself. Wendy Lewis pressed her on this a couple of times, and she said, no, I didn't drink that night. But then Wendy Lewis noted that Detective Maynard, in his report, had said that Carmen had consumed alcohol. Carmen paused and said, essentially, I guess if that's what his report said, then I guess so. Anyway, she also admitted to the curfew violation, but said that she had left the event early. She had tried to make it home on time, whatever. There was a minor concession made. Then they get into the letter. The one clean piece of impeachment that the defense actually may have landed, right? Carmen had written a letter to the judge that was overseeing her drug court case. His name was Judge Maybe. And this letter was dated February 15th, 2024. And she had claimed in that letter that she had been, because she was trying to go to Las Vegas like every other weekend or whatever to see her boyfriend. And so in her appeal to the judge, asking for the judge's permission to do so, she said, I have been 100% compliant with my probation. And so Wendy Lewis says, was that letter true then, based on everything we just talked about? Were you 100% compliant with your probation? And Carmen said, no, I guess not. So essentially, in this letter to the judge claiming 100% compliance, that was essentially false. Again, state's redirect does kind of pull back some of the damage that cross did. They reinforced the timeline on the gun, pre-probation, not really a violation in the technical sense. And the underlying facts about Carmen's arrangement with law enforcement, they were already before the jury from her original testimony, right? The jury already knew at this point that Carmen was no saint. They knew that she had sort of this checkered background. They knew that she had a criminal history. They knew that there was a complex relationship between her and Detective Maynard, right? So I personally did not feel really that this recall dramatically changed the jury's view of Carmen Lauber. I mean, I guess the letter to the judge is something that the jury is going to think about when they evaluate Carmen Lauber's credibility. She wrote to a judge. She lied about her compliance, and that is a fact. She admitted to it. How much weight they're going to give that alongside everything else, alongside of the obituary that we saw pinned to her mirror, right? The C&E stonemasonry hat that we saw hanging in her bedroom, all of the corroborating phone records, all of the cellular location data, everything that corroborates what she said happened, that's for the jury to weigh. The defense did get something here, I guess, but I don't think that it was the knockout that they were hoping for, but it was something. We arrive finally at Detective Jeff O'Driscoll with the Summit County Sheriff's Office, lead investigator on this case from March 2023 forward. He said he came in with fresh eyes deliberately. He said he didn't want to be locked into any prior assumptions. He wanted to follow the evidence wherever it went. That's what he said, right? He starts with the framework, 3 possible scenarios of how Eric Richins came to have this fatal amount of fent in his system, either accidental ingestion of something that was maybe unknowingly laced, intentional self-ingestion of this substance, meaning Eric took it himself on purpose, knowing what the outcome would be, or someone gave it to him deliberately, right? This is what he was going into this whole investigation. This is what I'm going to find. One of these 3 things, okay? His job was to evaluate all 3 possibilities. The first thing he did, he said the first thing he did was pulled Eric's DOPL history. This is a database in the state of Utah. Each state has their own. In my state, it's called the PMP, right? This is a database that tracks controlled substance prescriptions. Eric Richins had 0 prescribed controlled substances. None. He had none. No pain pills, no patches, no narcotics, no controlled prescriptions whatsoever. For a man that the defense is trying to portray as someone who was self-medicating chronic pain, that's a meaningful finding. Now, one of the moments that I absolutely lived and died for, right? It landed exactly as hard as I had hoped it would. After Eric's death, KOURI wrote, we all know at this point, KOURI wrote and published a children's book titled Are You With Me? This was a book about children who are grieving the loss of a parent. She went on to this Good Things Utah to promote it. She did a radio interview. She described herself in her own email to the TV show as a self-author who had written, and I'm quoting directly from the exhibit, quote, what appears to be the first children's book about losing a parent. KOURI, slow down, babe. I did one Google search. I know you did the same thing. You were not the first. Take all the seats. Relax. Let's reel it in a little bit here. But again, it goes to me to show what KOURI thought about herself. What she did not say, what she never said publicly, but what Day 12 revealed to the jury for the first time is that KOURI didn't write this book, babes. KOURI did not write this book. I remember doing a live with Kathy and we started touching on this book, and there was a debate about how did KOURI write it? Did KOURI not write it? You know, and some people were like, oh no, it was bad. She definitely wrote it. And some people were like, it was terrible. She definitely didn't. Like, it could have gone either way. Okay. But here's what we saw. We saw 141 pages of text messages between KOURI and a service called Book Writing Lane. Okay. 141 pages. This is KOURI providing story ideas. This is KOURI reviewing drafts, but this is a paid ghostwriting service doing the actual writing while KOURI positioned herself publicly as a grieving mother who was writing from the heart for and with her boys. And then it gets even more specific. We get into February 28th, 2023. KOURI texts her brother DJ about the book and says, quote, it turned out so cute. Just something for the boys and to understand the book writing process to get ready for the big one. The big one. DJ asks what the big one costs. She explains a 130-page ghost-written book runs about $5,000. She wants 250 pages, so she's thinking $10,000. She says, quote, this lady does payment plans. I might just start my recordings now and wait to sign up until May when more money comes in, hopefully. LOL. If KOURI didn't do this, she certainly is not my favorite person either way. Either way this goes. Wait until May. Wait until more money comes in, hopefully. LOL. This is February 28th. This is less than a year after the death of Eric. She is planning, because we're not talking about the children's book. She says we're waiting for while I plan the big one, right? I feel like KOURI's planning to just write this massive book. I don't know about her life or about what happened with Eric or whatever, but she's planning on making more profit, in my opinion, on her tragedy and on the tragedy of her children and off the tragedy of Eric's family and loved ones, right? This entire community who's been going through this with her, and she just wants to write a book. Write a book. This is KOURI texting DJ about waiting for the money that she was presumably expecting to receive from Eric's estates, from Eric's life insurance policies, one of which we have addressed here was possibly completely fake and forged, right? From all of the financial interests that she has been fighting for since the day that Eric died, March 22nd, 2023, 3 weeks before her arrest, she texts her brother DJ about the children's book, saying that she makes $5.35 for every copy that is sold on Amazon. She's building a website at this point to sell direct so that she can make $10 per copy. And she says, quote, the next 30 days are just extreme marketing. My goal is to sell 100,000 books by the end of the year. 100,000 books by the end of the year. Ghostwriting is not a crime. And certainly using a ghostwriter is not evidence of someone being an unaliver. Not related, right? But it goes to show this public narrative that she is constructing. She's constructing this public narrative of this devoted wife, this grieving mother who is writing from the heart for her boys. And in a private reality, She's using a paid service, payment plans, revenue projections, waiting for more money to come in. Like, those two things just don't compute for me. Keep it together, Tiffany. Do not unravel. Although it is the name of your channel. That is why you named it. You did name it that for a reason. There was double, like, keep it together. Keep it together. In the context of a woman who is alleged to have taken the life of her husband and then very systematically appears to be building a public image of like devoted widowhood, right? The gap between the public image, right? This thing that she's trying to portray, and then the private text messages that we're seeing in court is a part of the pattern that I hope the jury has been watching for the last 2 weeks. That's all I'm going to say. We're going to move on to the next part of O'Driscoll's testimony. I'm going to take 2 seconds, BRB, listen to a little music. I did a little reset. I don't know why that part got me so angry, but it did. That wasn't the first time I got angry listening to it in court, but reset. Here we go. The next part of O'Driscoll's testimony was like how they got to Carmen. So O'Driscoll walks through how the investigation arrived at Carmen Lauber because the defense has spent some real energy here trying to portray Carmen as a witness that investigators built around their theory and not the other way around. And so O'Driscoll's job here was to show the jury how the evidence actually led where it led. It started with the autopsy, of course, finding out that not only did Eric Richins have fent in his blood, he had fent in his gastric contents in the amount that it was in, which was just an insane amount, right? It had been swallowed. It had been ingested. Someone put fent into Eric's mouth. Either Eric put it into his mouth or someone put it into something that Eric drank or something that Eric ate, right? That single fact narrowed the question significantly for investigators. From there, we have the phone downloads, both Corey's phone and Eric's phone. And when they analyze all of the billing records and what was actually on these devices, found all of these discrepancies. They found communications that should have been there and were not there. And in like among all of that data, one contact stood out on Corey's phone for the sheer volume. Carmen Lauber. Hundreds of text messages. They investigated Carmen. They found out about her history, and then they found something extraordinary for their investigation. Through this recorded prison phone call, investigators come across the inmate describing a conversation with Carmen in which she had said she had just made a bunch of money selling illicit street drugs. The date of that call, March 4th, 2022, day that Eric Richins died. Let that land. On the day that Eric Richins was found unalived from, we find out later, fent overdose, there is a recorded phone call in which an inmate says, "Don't worry about it, Carmen's got it. She just made a bunch of money selling fent." So investigators do what investigators do. They start surveilling Carmen. They searched her trash. They executed a search warrant on her residence in April of 2023. Inside of that residence, among Carmen's personal things, which we saw photos of, right? All of these inspirational quotes, her family photos, right? These items that a person surrounds themselves with in their own bedroom. That's where they find Eric's obituary, posted dead center in her mirror amongst other family photos. Like, it was there. Carmen wanted to see this every day. She wanted to remember Eric. I personally feel like that was dead center because Carmen was experiencing a lot of guilt, even though she didn't know what was happening when she allegedly gave these substances to KOURI. She didn't know what they were being used for. We heard her testify to the call that she made to KOURI's, or the text saying, please tell me these were not for him, right? And now she's got his obituary dead center in her mirror where she has to look at it every single day. I think that shows that she's having some guilt. Again, this is just my opinion. This is not fact. This is not evidence. I feel like it's showing that she is experiencing a lot of guilt for the part that she realizes she may have played in the death of Eric Richins. And whatever Carmen felt about what she had done, it was there. The jury saw the photographs of this. They also found in Carmen's room, I know I mentioned it earlier without any context, but here we are. The jury also found in Carmen's room a C&E stonemasonry hat, Eric's company. Carmen was interviewed 6 times over several weeks for roughly 10 hours. And again, there were roughly 900 to 1,000 pages of transcripts. Her account did emerge gradually. There were details that she eventually uh gave to investigators that were tracked against other independently gathered evidence, right? She didn't just walk in on day 1 and tell them this story, right? She came to it. So now we come to May 8th, 2023. That day, investigators also executed a search warrant of the Richins' home. They waited until the boys had left for school before going inside, and inside the home, on the nightstand, on KOURI's side of the bed, they find this orange notebook. The entry for the night of March 3rd, 2022, the night before Eric's body was found. I want to give some of this to you directly in case you didn't catch it in trial, because KOURI's words are much more illuminating than any paraphrase. So here we go. Quote, the day started out as a typical day. They all say that, right? Anyway, that afternoon, I made dinner. We all ate as usual and ended the night like any other evening. Around 8:30, I read the kids' books, and about 9, they all climbed into bed. Eric had been on his phone most of the evening in a texting war with a hunting guide from Mexico. Around 9 or 9:15, he was screaming mad at these guys and threw his phone. At that point, he said, let's go have a celebration drink. We went into the kitchen and both started grabbing ingredients for a Moscow Mule and a lemon drop shot. End quote. She goes on to describe them kissing, saying goodnight, going to sleep. And then the entry for March 4th, 3:20 a.m. said, I woke up from sleeping with Ashton and went to crawl back into my bed. It was dark and awkwardly quiet. Eric snores more times than not. I crawled into bed and went on Eric's side of the bed and put my arm over him. He was cold, very cold. So I pulled the blanket up on him, but his body just felt so strange. I kept nudging him and just remember the stiffness of his body. He was pale or yellow, mouth open. I grabbed my phone and called 911 and ran up to Eric to see if he was breathing or had a pulse, but he didn't. I pulled him as hard as I could to get him down and began CPR, which we know, because we heard the 911 call. You didn't do that, okay? Stop it right there. Stop it right there. She writes that she pulled him as hard as she could. She began CPR. You heard that 911 call. I heard that 911 call. The dispatcher asked her to do CPR, and KOURI said, nope, can't do it, don't know how. And when she was pressed further, she was like, I can't touch him. I can't. Dispatcher continues to try to walk her through CPR, trying to walk her through getting him off the bed. Her resistance, her hesitation, he's just dead weight. That's what's on the audio record of that call. That is not what KOURI wrote in her diary. You know, she pulled him off the bed as hard as she could and started CPR. That's not what we heard, KOURI. Those two accounts cannot both be true, ma'am. Welcome to Tiff Unravels. Okay. She also writes, quote, "The worst part of it all was when they were pumping his lungs and blood went everywhere. I began screaming at the EMTs that they weren't doing it right. And I immediately ran to the bathroom and began throwing up." End quote. None of those things happened. None of those things appear in the body cam footage from the first responders that we have seen in this courtroom. The standard physiological indicators that CPR had been performed were not present when first responders arrived. Look, this entire orange notebook, to me, is it proof of guilt? No. What it reads like to me, again, personal opinion only, is someone composing the story that they wanted rather than recording what actually happened. It's like a rewrite. And now, thank God, the jury has heard both versions, okay, side by side. They heard the audio of the 911 call. They saw the body cam footage of the first responders, and now they're hearing the written account by KOURI that directly contradicts what we saw and heard, in my opinion. Okay. The notebook also contains like this running timeline of the days that follow Eric's death. And it tells you what, in my opinion, I keep saying that, I'm sorry, but I don't want to get in trouble. What I think it's showing is exactly what was on KOURI's mind in the aftermath of losing her husband. I didn't think it was grief. I thought it was strategy. March 5th, the day after Eric's body was found. Friends, sleepover, drinks, dancing. March 6th, locksmith to open the safe. Amy tried to stop me from opening it. March 7th, picked up Eric's truck. March 12th, Cody cleared out garage. March 14th, C&E stonemasonry computer was retrieved. And then there's the legal entries. March 28th, filed first complaint on trust for the house. May 3rd, filed for partial summary judgment on C&E stonemasonry. She was in court fighting over her unalived husband's business within weeks of his death, by the way. And the diary also notes her awareness of the private investigator doing what Todd Gabler was doing, right? She's making notes about Cody. She's making notes about people around the investigation. I just didn't feel, again, is it proof? No. Like a direct proof of what she did. Did she say in this diary, I did this thing? No. But in my opinion, I don't find this to be like some diary of a grieving widow that's like trying to hold herself together. I do feel like it's notes of someone who's managing a situation, who's tracking information, who's keeping her story straight, who's monitoring people who are involved in the investigation, who's fighting on multiple legal fronts simultaneously, all while Eric had just died. And tucked amongst the entries, not dated, but sitting there, quote, found out Eric had been consulting a divorce attorney. He had been talking to a divorce lawyer. He had. And then he died. Detective O'Driscoll continues his testimony by talking about something that was found inside of a kitchen cabinet during the search of the home in November. This was a handwritten note. It wasn't a diary entry. It wasn't a letter. It was literally a list. It was a bullet point cheat sheet, in my opinion. I'll go through some of what was on it. Eric Holmes, 6'2", 630, fighting with Mexican, drinking in bed. He drank half. Brushed his teeth. I was in bed after I brushed mine. Talked through the doorway. Moscow mules. Lemon drops. Vodka from. And to March 21st, gone. Funeral. Didn't have my phone. Kids bed around 9 o'clock. Drink around 9 p.m. In bed around 9:30. 9:45, I lay down. This is someone rehearsing a timeline. This is someone who's like making sure they're hitting their marks. Not proof, not evidence, just my opinion. I mean, it is being presented as evidence, but my interpretation of it is just my own interpretation of it. The jury will have their own, I suppose, but I feel like this is just someone who's making sure they remember which version of events they've told and will continue to tell. These are not just spontaneous notes that someone makes when they're processing grief. Or maybe they are. Fuck, I don't know. That's the crazy thing about grief and about human beings. We're all so different. We all process things in our own ways. I don't know. I don't know. We get into the set for life text messages, which I've already introduced, right? We had this big fight over them. Well, they were formally presented through O'Driscoll here on this day in front of the jury. We have Kouri in jail texting her brother asking if Eric has ever said anything about unaliving himself. And she says, no, not unaliving. Specifically, just that if anything ever happened to him, we would be set for life. Right. Again, context. In context of everything else. Are these text messages in isolation damning for her? No. She's saying, no, he said these things. However, in the context of forged beneficiary forms, taking out life insurance policies behind his back without his authorization, changing beneficiaries of current life insurance policies without his authorization or consent, the closing of the Midway Mansion, the legal battles that were launched within days of this man's death, right? The phrase set for life lands like something very final. Prosecution had also introduced 2 jail calls that I just want to spend a moment on because I do feel like they illuminate something important about Kouri's relationship to her own situation. August 2023, Kouri calling her mother from jail. They're talking about like the media coverage and they're talking about the Valentine's Day allegation, right? The theory that Kouri attempted to poison Eric with this doctored sandwich on Valentine's Day 2022, just weeks before Eric actually passed away, leaving a love note on it. And Kouri's reaction from jail about all of this, she's laughing. She thinks it's hilarious. She is just beside herself. It's so funny. They're saying I put a love note on a poison sandwich and put it in his car. What the hell? that that's not how it actually sounded, but you know. And she's like, "Oh my god, they can really come up with some wild shit, right? They just sit around a table and see who can come up with the craziest stories." Like it's I don't know. And then immediately she just starts to pivot about like what her nanny can testify to, what her receipts can prove, what her narrative is going to be. It just doesn't seem like emotional processing. It's case management. And she finds the public speculation on what happened to Eric humorous. It's weird. I do want to be fair. There, of course, is an argument that someone who is innocent might respond to what they consider absurd allegations with laughter, right? Maybe devil's advocate, guys, do not come for me. Maybe Kouri didn't do this. And she's like, what? This is insane, right? And she finds it humorous. She's laughing about it because it's absolutely outlandish. That's a real argument, sure, but she's calling from jail. So she'd been arrested for unaliving her husband. This is the father of her children. And when that specific allegation comes up, she laughs. She calls it wild shit. And she immediately starts going into the narrative that contributes to managing her story. So, of course, you guys can draw your own conclusions. The jury absolutely will. I'm so interested to know what conclusions they are drawing. Then we get into the walk the dog letter, and now we come to it. 6 handwritten pages. All of these were written in September. While Kouri Richins was in custody at the Summit County Jail, it was recovered from an LSAT prep book, right, among her personal possessions. And O'Driscoll actually read this aloud, every single page that was admissible. I think it was not the entire 6 pages. I think it was 3, like I said. But here we go. Page 1, walk the dog, but take vague notes so you remember. Here's what I'm thinking, but you have to talk to Ronnie. He would probably have to testify this. This letter is addressed in substance to Kouri's mother, Lisa Darden. In its instructions, because that's what I take this letter as, instructions. Defense obviously has a different take on this letter. Its instructions, IMO, in my opinion, are detailing what her mother needs to tell her brother Ronnie and what Ronnie then needs to tell Corey's attorney, who at the time was Sky Lazaro, not her attorney anymore. At the time, it was Sky. She references Sky in the letter. This letter literally is instructing Ronnie to tell Sky about a year before Eric's death. Ronnie was at the Richins home. They were watching football. Eric was alone with Ronnie, told him that he gets pain pills and fentanyl from Mexico from workers at some ranch, and how Eric told Ronnie not to tell Corey because she would get really upset, going on about making sure that he says that she always accused him of getting high every night and not helping her with the kids. Eric would also go on to tell Ronnie that he kept the pain pills in an allergy bottle in his work truck, specifically so that Corey would never find them. The letter goes on to explain the purpose of this fabricated story. It would explain why no fentanyl was found in the house. It would connect Eric to a Mexico substance supply chain. She said, quote, "The connection has to be made with Mexico and substances," because the letter says he hid them in the allergy bottle in the truck, and Cody emptied out the truck within a week of Eric's death, right? So, like, Cody's covering up for this shit now, according to Corey, or what she wants her brother to say. It instructs her mother how to execute this. She says, meet with Ronnie in person, go to Salt Lake to do it. Why? Quote, "I worry sometimes your house and phone are bugged. Don't overanalyze it. It's just a quick 2-minute conversation. Tell him I need him to do this." And then the final line that gives the letter its name, "walk the dog," but take vague notes of all of this so that you remember. This is literally just remember the story, get rid of this, likely get rid of this, take vague notes, but get rid of this letter and tell it to Ronnie, okay? So that he knows what to say. I feel like, in my opinion, this is an instruction manual for manufacturing her defense. Kouri Richins from jail directing her mother to coach her brother to tell a fabricated story to her attorney. A story that is designed to explain away the prosecution's central evidence. It is, by any reasonable person reading this letter, unless I'm absolutely fucking delusional, obstruction of justice and witness tampering. Is it not? And it was written in her own hand. It was read aloud, word for word, in front of that jury. When O'Driscoll finished reading this letter, prosecution finished by saying no further questions. That was it. Let's get into cross-examination of Detective O'Driscoll. Gotta be real with you here. I was really looking forward to the testimony of Detective O'Driscoll. I mean, since even before this trial started, I couldn't wait to hear what he had to say. Direct examination did deliver. Don't get me wrong. We saw the orange notebook, the timeline, right? The walk the dog letter, the ghostwriter reveal. We saw all of that. Okay. All of that landed. And that part was everything. It meant a lot. I felt like it gave a lot of weight to the case, to the prosecution's case in chief. But then cross-examination started, and I have to be honest with you, I really did come away from cross-examination of O'Driscoll a little bit flat. And I don't think I'm alone in that, but I also think it might be somewhat of an unpopular opinion right now because people are just so energized by the evidence itself that maybe a lot of us aren't separating the evidence from the witness, and that's what my brain was doing. And I just couldn't help it. The prosecution rested its direct examination on that walk the dog letter, and then Kathy Nestor began her cross, and she went into absolutely everything that she was allowed to go into and tried to go into some things she wasn't allowed to go into, but that's what she does, right? Anyway, on a number of fronts, I feel like Kathy Nestor found more purchase than I expected. The poor choice of words moment, let's start here, right? Because this is one of the ones that stuck with me quite a bit. So when they were playing the Carmen Lauber interview clips, the ones that were allowed to be published, right? The jury heard Detective Maynard tell Carmen, quote, "Give us the details that will ensure Kouri gets convicted of murder." Nestor zeroes in on this language, and Detective O'Driscoll, his defense of it was that it was just, quote, "a poor choice of words," end quote. He says that Detective Maynard was really just trying to explain what level of detail a cooperation agreement would require, right? And that felt a little bit thin to me. It felt like O'Driscoll was kind of on the stand covering for a partner rather than actually addressing what the jury just heard. Poor choice of words is kind of like what you say when you accidentally send a work email to the wrong person, but when a detective tells a key witness exactly what conclusion her story needs to reach, I feel like that deserved a stronger, more direct answer. And I don't feel like we got that from him on cross. I feel like the jury also noticed that. I noticed. And I do feel like it was a moment where he needed to do more or say more and just didn't. And that's a recurring theme throughout his cross-examination, in my opinion. So then we get into the walk the dog letter and Nestor's argument. Now, here's one thing that irritated me. She was highlighting segments of this letter and saying, "Don't you see areas of this letter where she said Eric went to Mexico to receive like she was reading the letter as if it were fact on paper, forgetting that it was written by Kouri with the words starting out like, "Make sure Ronnie says this." She skipped that part and was just reading. It was weird. Like she was reading the letter as if it were like just facts that she was reminding them of. I don't know. Like she was making it seem like Eric really had told Ronnie about getting drugs from Mexico and that Kouri was trying to make sure that very true, very factual information was reaching her attorney. I don't know. O'Driscoll's response to this was that investigators did try to reach out to Ronnie, but he had declined to be interviewed, so they couldn't confirm or deny that any of this actually took place. And that's a fair answer as far as it goes, right? He did note the contradiction. The letter describes Eric hiding pills in an allergy bottle in his truck, but the hydrocodone bottle is the one that the defense is making this big deal out of. That is the bottle that was photographed on his nightstand the night that he died. Overall, on the letter, I just felt like he was a little bit more reactive than authoritative. He did answer what was asked of him, but he didn't push back with the confidence that this kind of evidence could have arguably warranted. I just feel like it felt a little flat. And then she gets to Carmen Lauber, and this I feel like is where Kathy Nestor was most effective. And O'Driscoll gave her, unfortunately, I feel like a lot to work with. He starts asking her about foil, like tinfoil that was found in the trash. He couldn't confirm that it was fentanyl specifically. Carmen Lauber's first interview denial of the entire situation. I mean, because again, she said that Kouri never asked her for fentanyl in that first interview, and law enforcement was the one who introduced the word fent to Carmen before she ever used it herself. There were 6 interviews over several weeks, and Carmen was like receiving rides from detectives to her like drug court meetings and attorney meetings. Detective Maynard, her probation officer, and one of the interviewers was checking in on her regularly throughout this entire process. So, all of these things Detective O'Driscoll had to concede to because they were things that happened. And to his credit, he didn't try to dodge them. But to his credit, he didn't dodge, I mean, that's a pretty modest compliment. I just don't feel like there was a lot of authority on this cross examination from the lead detective on the case. Then Kathy Nestor goes into like the investigative gaps, right? She works through them methodically. So there is no fent found across 10 search warrants of the home. There were no cups, there were no glasses, there were no straws with fentanyl that were tested or found. There were no actual pills from the alleged Carmen to Corey transactions that were ever recovered. And O'Driscoll could not say exactly how the fentanyl was delivered to Eric. He tried. If you saw, you know what I mean? He tried. But they go into talking about how Ronnie's phone was never subpoenaed. The hydrocodone bottle from the nightstand was never tested while it was in law enforcement's possession, and it was in fact discarded. There was just a lot of like, I don't recall. There was a lot of, I can't speak to that, and that wasn't handled by me. It was handled by another detective. Look, I'm not saying that O'Driscoll should know every single detail about every single part of this investigation. There were a lot of different detectives that handled a lot of different parts of the case. I sure absolutely agree to that. This is a large investigation, and that's how large investigations work. But for this to be the prosecution's final witness, right? The lead detective, the person that the jury has been waiting for weeks at this point to hear from, I just feel like there were a lot of moments on cross-examination where the answer was consistently, I don't know, or that wasn't me. And cumulatively, that's a big word. It really just left me wanting more from O'Driscoll, if that makes sense. So day 12 ends at this point. It's not done though. It continues. The cross-examination of Detective O'Driscoll does continue into Thursday. I guess I'll hold my full assessment of Detective O'Driscoll until we finish with him in day 13 because we're not done. I went into it thinking that maybe day 13 would give me a different impression. Maybe he'll find his footing. Maybe the redirect does some repair work, right? Maybe things will change about how I view him as a witness. I don't know. I was very open to that, but I'll be honest. As I was going into day 13, I was carrying something I didn't expect to be carrying, which again, the evidence that he presented was extraordinary. We got to see the things we had been waiting to see, things that really, in my opinion, circumstantially implicate Kouri Richins in the death of her husband, right? But the man that was delivering it on cross-examination, at least on day 12 at this point, really just left me wanting a lot more than what he was giving. Let me know how you guys felt at this point. Let's get into Thursday. We're almost there. What did day 13 give us? I know you guys were all there. I know if you're watching me, I know most of you already know what happened. One thing I knew was going to happen, the state rested. I knew that Detective O'Driscoll was going to be the state's last witness. I knew that the state was going to rest. What else happened on day 13? Of course, defense filed their directed verdict motion. The judge, of course, denied it. But guess what? We find out that the defense is putting on 0 witnesses. 0! Defense rests in day 13. Sorry, spoiler alert. Without putting on a single witness, without calling a single person to the stand. And Kouri Richins, the woman whose life is on the line, the woman whose name is literally the name of this trial instead of Eric Richins, it's Kouri Richins, sat in that courtroom and told the judge on record that she is waiving her right to testify. She's not getting on the stand. She's never going to sit in that hot seat. She's never going to answer a single question. Not about the walk the dog letter, not about the orange notebook, not about the cheat sheet that they found. None of it, any of it, none of it, 0 of it. But all right, let's get there in order. Okay, day 13 was, despite all of this, was a full day. It started outside jury presence, more arguments, more of, the jury being elsewhere while lawyers continue to deal with the same business that we left dealing with last night. We start talking about the GIFs. the gifts, whatever, do not come from me. I do not want to be a part of this debate. I swear to God, I don't. Sometimes I say GIF, sometimes I say GIF. It depends on what my tongue does, what my mouth does, and how I'm feeling that day. Don't come for me. I don't care. Anyway, so they start talking about these GIFs, just to make some of you mad, that were accessed the morning that Eric's body was found, right? These Kevin Spacey, the Trump, the Dumb and Dumber, like the money everywhere, like, I'm so sad, but I'm so rich, like those things. Anyway, whatever. I don't know. They get into a bunch of that. Now, the arguments that I found significant was defense starts talking about this David Norris situation, right? This is a courtroom moment that I was just kind of like, wait a minute, what's happening? Here's what you need to know about David Norris. Defense had been trying to introduce testimony from him. David Norris, this is all outside of jury presence, by the way, so none of this is official or on the record. It's just what we know. He allegedly claimed that in 2019, 3 years before Eric died, Eric had approached him and asked him if he had any fentanyl. So defense's theory, I guess, if David Norris was, if this stuff was admissible, their theory would be if Eric was seeking fentanyl on his own back in 2019, then maybe what happened in March of 2022 wasn't outside of the scope of what could have happened, right? Maybe Eric sought it out himself. The judge, however, had already ruled Norris's testimony as like inadmissible. He couldn't testify. But on this morning, Nestor made one more attempt to bring his testimony into this trial, framing it as like, okay, even if his testimony can't come in, I should at least be able to let the jury know that the investigators received this tip and they chose not to follow up, right? She's going down the incomplete investigation route. Here's where the judge did. I love this man. I love Judge Mrazek. So what he does is he cites some legal stuff that I can't begin to pretend to understand, right? Anyway, but what he does is he explains it like this. Okay, Miss Nestor, I've thought about this, and I'm willing to allow it if you understand that if you open the door to the incomplete investigation theory through the Norris situation, then the state is also going to be entitled to rebut it by introducing their own evidence of how investigators did respond to tips, including recorded, like audio, video recorded statements of Hayden Jeffs, which had already been thrown out or ruled inadmissible previously. He's like, but if you open that door, then this is going to be allowed in, right? The Hayden Jeffs audio recordings or video recordings and the recorded jail call of Nick Savage, who was Carmen Lauber's friend. This is the guy who said like, oh yeah, don't worry, Carmen's got it. She just made some money selling Fent, right? Now, again, Hayden Jeffs. Now, we heard from his wife. I can't remember if it was his wife or just his long-term partner. But he was a handyman who had worked with KOURI, and there is apparently a recorded police interview where he describes KOURI asking him to get the Fent. We hadn't heard of this before now, or I hadn't. She told KOURI, according to him in this interview, how dangerous this stuff was. And he says no. She called back and she asked again. Now, Hayden Jeffs is the handyman who died in the motorcycle accident before trial began. And so all of these statements were excluded from the case because of hearsay rules. But if defense opens this door, the judge says they come in, all of it. The whole recorded interview is allowed in. And Nick Savage, who again is the inmate who in that recorded jail call on the very day that Eric Richins died, described Carmen making money from selling Fent. That call also recorded. Nick Savage, this is just statements, right? None of this is like recorded on audio or video, which Bloodworth says like, okay, sure. I mean, we have it on audio. We have it on video. So if they want to bring in his like whatever little statement, that's fine. But we get to bring in actual recorded statements. So Judge looks at the defense table and says, essentially, in fact, I think he used the term high stakes poker. He explained it very clearly to the defense. If you want to get Norris's testimony in front of the jury, that's fine. I'll concede to that. Okay. We'll let it in. But if you do, the state gets to play its hand as well, which means Hayden Jeff's recorded interviews come in. Nick Bond Savage's jail calls come in. Same thing. The defense says, we need a few minutes to, speak with our client, whatever. What do you guys think happened? Well, I'll tell you. Defense came back completely folded. Folded. We understand your ruling, Your Honor, and we will not be proceeding with that line of questioning. Chickened out entirely. Look, I'm only going to dwell on this for a second. Defense came to this trial, I don't know with what theory, okay? But I feel like some of their theories were the investigation was sloppy, the investigators were biased, they ignored the evidence that Eric might have been a voluntary substance user. They cross-examined O'Driscoll on investigative gaps for like a full full day. And when they had the chance to push that theory to its full conclusion, when they could have put Norris on the stand, the judge conceded and said, you know what, I'll allow it. They backed out because the judge had made very clear the cost was letting the jury hear KOURI Richins was asking a now unalived handyman for fent in his own recorded words, in his own recorded statement, and a substance dealer who was confirming in a jail call that Carmen had just made money selling fent. That was a fold. They said, no way, Jose, forget it. We never forget we even asked. Anyway, let's wrap up with the final part of O'Driscoll's cross-examination. Didn't like it any more than I did the day before. She started the cross-examination talking about the gifts, whatever you want to call them. They couldn't prove whether they had come from Eric, from KOURI, who sent them, when, where, whatever, right? And then she started she started pressing again on these investigative gaps, right? The things that were never found, the evidence that no longer exists, right? The hydrocodone bottle, and the questions that the investigation never really fully answered. The orange notebook cross landed about where I expected it. Again, Nestor tried to portray the entries as like trauma journaling, right? This is just a grieving woman who's processing these traumatic experiences by writing a version of events that was emotionally true for her. Maybe not factually precise. This was just her processing her grief, sure. KOURI's psychological state, right? But the notebook is what the notebook is, and the entries say what the entries say, and they stand against what that body camera footage showed me from that morning that actually was documented. And it was very different. Very. She talked about the forgery, the Valentine's Day incident. She challenged whether the evidence actually proved what the state was claiming it proved. She hit some of the same themes that she had hit before, right? The signing on behalf of a spouse doesn't inherently mean that this is like fraudulent behavior, right? It's not intent to defraud. But ultimately, O'Driscoll he held his ground on like the general framework of the investigation, but he still was unable to fill in some of these evidentiary gaps that she was pointing at because, and those gaps are real. They are real. The summary questions near the end of Cross were much sharper. You have no murder weapon, right? Nothing was ever found. No fentanyl contaminated food, drink container was ever recovered from the home. You can't show me the physical mechanism by which Eric Richins ingested this fatal dose of fentanyl. And O'Driscoll had to concede to all of that. He didn't pretend that those things weren't true. He conceded. Here's where I landed. The gaps that Nestor exposed were very real. gaps. And so my day 12 critique going into day 13, that critique stands. I'm not going to walk that back. I just don't feel like he gave last witness energy. Like, this is not what I feel like you should have left the state on. Now, Gabler, that would have been like bombshell type stuff. Like, that's what I would want the jury to remember if I'm not a lawyer. I have no idea how to be one. I don't even pretend to. But I can imagine that, like, if I was a lawyer and I wanted to leave a lasting impression on a jury, I would end with Gabler and just kind of have O'Driscoll somewhere in the middle, right? Where it's like, well, yeah, we heard what he said, but like there was this before and this after, right? I don't know. But here's what I'll add as far as like the O'Driscoll testimony goes. And this is just my opinion. I do feel like the cross examination across both of these days was just longer than it was damaging. Was it damaging in some places? Yeah, I do. Yes. Yes. I do feel like Kathy Nesser worked really hard. I feel like, again, I do feel like Kouri's attorneys are really putting up a fight for her. It doesn't mean I like them, but they are doing what they are setting out to do. And when I take a step back and I look at the full cross examination rather than like any single moment, I see a detective who conceded to things he had to concede to. I do feel like he held his ground on things that he felt like mattered. I don't feel like he ever really gave Kathy Nesser a very clean, clear, dramatic moment that would make a juror like sit up, straight in their seat and think like this investigation was corrupt or biased or fundamentally wrong. Like, I don't think that happened. I do think she muddied some waters. I just don't feel like she drained the pool, if that makes sense. So then state got to redirect, and it did change things a little bit for me. Brad Bloodworth, he stood up for redirect. He is doing things true to himself. He's not flashy. He's not dramatic. He's just very efficient. He's very targeted. And there was some repair work that needed to be done. The core of the redirect, I felt like, was this. Detective O'Driscoll, as Brad Bloodworth put it, was not omniscient, right? He's not supposed to know everything about this case. He's never supposed to know everything. He is one person who works in a small sheriff's office who served as the lead investigator in a case that eventually generated terabytes of information across a dozen different disciplines. He said, like, the sheriff's office didn't even have digital forensics capabilities until later into the investigation. They didn't even have forensic accounting capabilities, I think still to this day, if I'm not mistaken. So it's like, yeah, there are gaps in this investigation because it's a very small office. So when defense spends a day and a half pointing at all of the things that O'Driscoll didn't know, all of the things he couldn't speak to, all of the financial analysis that he had no idea about, right? And using that to argue that the investigation was incomplete or incompetent, what redirect made clear was, yes, there were some gaps there, but those things were handled by people other than O'Driscoll because they required specialized expertise that the sheriff's office just didn't have in-house. That's why they brought in Brooke Carrington for the forensic accounting. That's why there were gaps. And he says, no, I can't know every single detail. I do think that reframing probably left a little bit of an impression on a jury, not because it erased everything that Nestor had genuinely chipped away at, right? Some of those chips are very real, but it did give the jury a frame for how to interpret, like, O'Driscoll's limits and how he wasn't answering, like, authoritatively throughout the entire cross-examination. I don't think he's a sloppy investigator. I don't know. I do think that he's a lead detective at a very small sheriff's office who correctly identified that certain parts of this investigation were too big for what they were capable of. They required expertise that his office didn't have. And so he worked with all of these other people, the county attorney and all of these people, to bring in folks who had the expertise that they needed to solve this case. So then Bloodworth went directly after one of the things that really did kind of bother me the most from the cross-examination, which was Carmen Lauber's biggest piece of the puzzle comments. Like, So Nestor had highlighted a moment in one of the interviews where O'Driscoll or Maynard, I can't remember which one, had told Carmen she was the biggest piece of the puzzle in this case. And she used that on cross to suggest that law enforcement was essentially telling Carmen that she needed to play along, right? That they were elevating her importance to shape her cooperation. So on redirect, Bloodworth gets up and he asks O'Driscoll, what was the context of that comment? Yeah, we heard you say it, but what was the context of it? And O'Driscoll's answer was clarifying, right? He said, we were working specifically to establish the substance purchase timeline. Carmen was the biggest piece of that specific part of the puzzle. This was the piece they just didn't have yet, right? This was the part of the chain that they needed to understand. And that interview predated the digital forensic investigation. So it predated any of the forensic accounting work. It predated every other major branch of that investigation. Biggest piece meant she was the biggest piece of what they were trying to figure out at that moment in time. It didn't mean she was like the linchpin of this entire case. And I feel like that is a meaningful distinction. So he talked about the EpiPens, it ended up being like one of the kids' EpiPens, right? He had a condition that required an EpiPen, talked about the GIFs or GIFs, whatever. That was it. O'Driscoll was finally released from his subpoena. He's free to go. Again, where it landed on him overall, I don't know. He wasn't my favorite witness, but I do feel like the evidence that came along with him was very important to the state's case. I definitely don't walk away from his testimony with this like triumphant capstone witness that I imagined before this trial started, but it's also not. I don't walk away with a picture of like an compromised or inadequate investigation either. I do feel like he's a hardworking detective from a really small office who correctly recognized the limits of his resources and brought in help. And so he didn't know every single detail. Do I wish he knew more? Yeah, I feel like he probably should have known a little more. Okay. But this case was built by a team. And I do feel like the case that was built is slightly devastating to Corey Richins. And after O'Driscoll steps down, parties handle some housekeeping, jury went to lunch, and then outside of jury presence, Bloodworth stands up and says, Your Honor, the state rests. So this part took place outside of jury presence. State intended that it was resting. And then, of course, the defense immediately moves for a directed verdict. This is very common. Their argument was that the evidence for aggravated murder, he went through all of it. Judge took a few minutes to think, came back, didn't just deny the motion, but he did set the tone for the rest of what happened that day. He said, it's not my job to decide if she is guilty. That is for the jury to decide. And there is definitely enough here for this to go to them. And so, of course, that was denied. This is the part that I felt like was just for a second, it was very surreal. I felt like, wait, and I had to rewind because I was like, no, I didn't just hear that. This is where the room went cold for weeks, even in opening statements. Defense has signaled that they just have this grand defense in place, right? They have this massive case to present. They cited, I think in opening statements or sometime early on in the trial, they had like 14 witnesses. Kathy Nestor even had an argument with the judge about like, well, this has never happened to me before. There are so many witnesses that we intend to recall. So why can't we just do our direct, right? For time management purposes alone, that would make our case, to save time, just so that they could go ahead and do their direct while these witnesses were girl. And the judge is like, okay, so who are we going to call first? The state has rested. Where are we going after lunch? Like, what are we doing? And even initially after that statement, right? They were like, well, we've got some things in the wings, or we've got a couple in the wings, whatever, right? Then there was a pause. There was a brief huddle. And then, quote, actually, Your Honor, at this time, the defense intends to rest. What? To what, mate? Come again? Huh? Those were my reactions. What? What do you mean the defense intends to rest? You had all this. What? You were like bluffing the whole time? Was it strategy? Was it like, I don't understand. What do you mean? What do you mean? Did any of you react that way, or were some of you like, yeah, makes sense? Like, does it make sense? Sure. Do they have the right not to present a case? Of course, the burden of proof is on prosecution and prosecution alone. I'm fully aware of that. It's just that I was like, bro, you've been yapping this whole trial. Like, what do you mean? So, the jury comes back because this took place outside of jury presence. So, of course, they come back. They officially make those resting statements in front of the jury, both prosecution and defense. Defense called no one, no experts to challenge the levels of fentanyl in the system, no friends to vouch for Corey's character, no one to explain this financial mess that they were in, not even Corey herself. They're betting Corey's life on the idea that the state's case is like messy enough to create doubt, I guess. I don't think they came by this decision lightly. Do I think that they had something prepared? Of sure, we would hope so. Right? Right? We would hope they had a case prepared, but maybe after discussion with Corey and maybe after realizing that, I mean, again, we just watched the Brendan Banfield trial where, like, when the defense started presenting their case, they were really just proving prosecution's points throughout the presentation of their case in chief. So I know that this happens, and maybe defense was like, you know what, based on everything we've heard so far, I feel like if we were to introduce these witnesses who would then be open to cross examination, or introduce this testimony that, would be, maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we should just leave it alone. We don't feel like they've proven this. So we just shut up. It's our right to shut up. And that's what they did. But I feel like, as far as the jury is concerned, I could be totally wrong, but I am a layperson. I could sit on a jury, right? When you have like 2.5 weeks of evidence on one side, evidence and testimony, and then zero on the other, I feel like that silence is very deafening. I could be wrong. Anyway, Corey officially waives her right to testify. She says she was following the advice of her attorneys, blah, blah, blah. You know, that whole thing. As far as strategically, is that the correct legal call? In this case, 100%, I believe so. Does that mean I didn't want to see Corey on that stand bullshitting her way through her testimony? Absolutely. I definitely wanted to see that. 100% I wanted to see that. Strategically, do I think that this was the right call? Yes. I feel like if she had taken that stand, prosecution would have shredded her. I feel like they would have walked her through every page of that walk the dog letter, every page of that orange notebook, talking about her bullshit CPR story, right? The 911 call, all of that. And by staying silent, she avoids those traps for sure. But she's also leaving the jury with no counter to any of the evidence that we've seen or heard so far. So anyway, then there was like this charging conference. Sorry, this is going into Sunday. I know it's late. Don't worry about it. So Friday, charging conference took place. So jury was at home. Lawyers were fighting over like all of the rules and jury instructions and more of the stuff, right? Snitch introduction, this whole reasonable doubt fight with this like terminology, the firmly convinced terminology, whatever, missing pill bottle, all of that. That happened yesterday. You didn't miss anything, nothing crazy. Anyway, looking back on week 3, because that was it, right? Monday's closing arguments. We're going to be on verdict watch soon. I feel like we've been waiting forever for this. Okay. Prosecution, I feel like, did build a good case. I feel like they built it in rings, right? Like each one kind of reinforces the other. You have the toxicology, you have the financial motive, you have the consciousness of guilt, right? And then you have this cheat sheet, and you have the walk the dog letter. You have all of these things. But defense did point to gaps, right? The missing bottle, the credibility of the drug dealer. These are very real points that they made as well. As the jury walked out of that courtroom on Friday for the weekend, I feel like they were left with 13 days of the state's story and zero from the defense. I just don't see how strategically that makes sense for them. I get that that's their right. I'm not disputing that. I understand. But like, the only thing that this jury is spending a weekend with is what they've heard from prosecution, and now that's it. I mean, yes, we have closing arguments. It's gonna take fucking 6 years for Kathy Nestor to finish hers, I'm sure. Actually, I think Wendy Lewis is doing them, so maybe they won't be as long, but still, I don't know. There are no time limits, by the way. The judge made that clear. And then 8 people on Monday are going to walk into a room. They're going to listen to that 911 call. They're going to see all this stuff about the orange notebook, the walk the dog letter. They're going to see all these images of Eric and his family, his boys. They are going to remember that his family was sitting in that front row of that courtroom every single day. They have all the space in the world now, and all they have is the state's case. I mean, look, if you're asking me personally, do I think KOURI Richins did this personally? I do think she did. Do I think that if defense had put on their case in chief, could they have put reasonable doubt? I do think there was room for reasonable doubt here. I mean, I'm not mad because I do think she did it. To be honest, is there room for reasonable doubt in the state's case? I believe so. And I'm not saying that, again, my personal opinions are my own as far as did she do it, did she not do it? But like, did they prove it? Like, I think as far as the Valentine's Day thing goes, I think that's gonna be a not guilty off. Like, I don't think they proved that. And I am worried that there's room for reasonable doubt with this jury as far as the aggravated murder case. And so maybe that's why. Maybe defense sensed that and they were just like, we don't gotta do nothing. They didn't prove it. I hope closing arguments are really good because I was just left wanting at the end of Thursday. I really was. Anyway, let me get out of here. I've held y'all for 2 hours again, but closing arguments are on Monday. We will very likely be on verdict watch on Monday. How long the jury's going to take to come back on this one, I have no idea. Imagine a couple of days, to be honest, because I feel like that's just my opinion. But I will be there for all of it. And I can't wait to talk to you guys about it. Get your thoughts, get your opinions, get your feelings. This is my favorite part. We are on the journey for what we can hope is justice for this man, for Eric Richins. This is why we're here. It's been a crazy trial. Thank you guys for watching it with me. I will see you on Monday to talk about closing arguments. And until I see you then, you know what to do. Please, please stay safe. Keep asking questions and keep unraveling. Love you.